What if everything you thought you knew about Archie Harrison's birth was completely wrong? What if the carefully crafted images, the public appearances, the royal narratives, and even the heartwarming social media moments were hiding a truth that no one, not even the closest palace staff, was allowed to speak about? Today, we dive into a revelation that shakes the very foundations of the Sussex household. It's a story that combines secrecy, shock, and a confounding mystery surrounding the arrival of one of the youngest members of the royal family. And at the center of it all is Lauren, Archie's nanny, whose long-held silence has now been broken in a confession that could change everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Lauren's admission isn't just another palace rumor. It's a first-hand account from someone who was inside, someone who had eyes and ears on events that the world never saw. According to her, Archie's arrival was unusual in ways that immediately raised eyebrows among the staff. Protocols were different, questions were forbidden, and even basic interactions with the newborn were shrouded in mystery. Staff members were reportedly told to follow strict instructions without understanding the reasons behind them. Imagine working every day with the royal family and suddenly noticing that the usual transparency you expect is gone. Questions met with silence, routines altered without explanation, and a hush that felt almost unnatural. From the moment Archie entered the world, the palace seemed determined to control every aspect of his existence. Lauren claims that even she, someone who had earned the trust of the Sussexes over years of dedicated service, was kept in the dark about crucial details. "I was always told to be discreet, to not ask questions, and to follow the instructions without hesitation," she explained in her startling revelation. To someone outside the palace walls, this might seem like standard protocol, but for insiders familiar with royal procedures, it was highly unusual. The level of secrecy and the strict instructions hinted at a deeper truth, one that raised immediate questions about Archie's arrival and whether Meghan Markle had given birth in the conventional sense that everyone believed. The world has followed Meghan and Harry's family journey with fascination, from their whirlwind courtship to the global media frenzy surrounding their wedding, and ultimately, the birth of their children. But while the public celebrated the arrival of Archie Harrison with joy, balloons, and carefully curated photographs, the palace corridors whispered a different story. Staff noticed anomalies that did not fit the typical patterns of a royal birth. Nurses and nannies reported schedules that were abruptly changed, interactions with the baby that were limited, and instructions that sometimes conflicted with what they had learned from previous royal households. It was as if the entire palace had entered a delicate dance of secrecy, with every step carefully choreographed to conceal something critical from even those who served closest. Lauren's decision to finally speak out comes after years of witnessing these anomalies firsthand. She recalls the first time she noticed something was off, the day Archie was brought home from the hospital, or perhaps, as she hints, from somewhere else entirely. Unlike previous royal children, there was an unusual veil over the proceedings. Staff who typically would have been involved in the welcoming process were sidelined, and even seasoned employees who had worked under multiple generations of the royal family were left confused. Lauren remembers whispering to herself, "This isn't how it's supposed to happen." Her instincts, sharpened by years of service, were telling her that something significant was being hidden, something that extended beyond ordinary royal discretion. Questions naturally arise. Why would Meghan Markle, someone known for her public transparency and media presence, choose to keep such a secret from her closest aides? Was this an isolated decision, or part of a broader strategy to control the narrative surrounding her family? According to Lauren, the secrecy wasn't just about privacy. It was about control, about ensuring that only a very specific story reached the public eye. Staff were carefully monitored, information was compartmentalized, and even routine medical care for the baby seemed to follow an unusual pattern. It was a pattern that, when pieced together, suggested that Archie's arrival might not have followed the standard path that everyone assumed. Lauren's confession has sent shockwaves through palace circles and the media alike. Experts have weighed in, noting that while royals often maintain privacy, the level of secrecy described by Lauren is extraordinary. Psychologists suggest that such tight control over information and interactions could be a means of managing public perception, especially in situations involving unconventional births or surrogacy. Legal analysts add another layer, speculating that confidentiality agreements and employment contracts may have been leveraged to enforce this secrecy. The implications are profound, not just for staff, but for public understanding of Archie Harrison's early life. Even within the walls of the royal household, whispers of unusual arrangements had begun circulating. Staff members noticed that certain caregivers were deliberately kept away from the nursery, that medical professionals were consulted in unusual ways, and that instructions were issued that sometimes seemed contradictory. Lauren recalls moments where she questioned decisions internally, but was warned, gently but firmly, not to pry. I had to trust the instructions, even when they didn't make sense, she says. This tension between duty and suspicion is what makes her testimony so compelling. It's not just that something unusual occurred, but that someone who knew the inner workings intimately was forced to observe it silently for years. And yet, the intrigue doesn't stop at secrecy. Lauren hints at emotional consequences for the staff, the baby, and even the royal parents themselves. The carefully maintained appearances, she says, created a palpable tension, one that affected interactions across the household. Staff were anxious, unsure what questions would be acceptable, and constantly alert to the expectations placed upon them. For a newborn, this environment is far from ordinary, raising questions about the impact of secrecy and control on early development. How did Archie Harrison experience these first months under a veil of mystery and constrained interaction? Lauren's account provides rare insight into a world that has been meticulously curated to present a flawless image to the outside world, while concealing what she now reveals may have been the truth all along. As the days turned into weeks, Lauren began noticing patterns that were impossible to ignore. The usual rhythm of a newborn in a royal household, late-night feedings, consistent medical checkups, and rotations of nannies familiar with the baby's needs, seemed different in Archie's case. Requests for updates on the baby's health were met with vague answers. Questions about his routines or feeding schedules were often redirected or outright discouraged. Lauren recalls the subtle but firm pressure to observe, follow instructions, and never inquire too deeply. We were trained to be perfect, but in this situation, perfect meant blind compliance, she said in her recent statement. For someone who had dedicated years to serving the royal family, this level of secrecy was unprecedented. Lauren had worked with other royal children before, witnessing the structured chaos that comes with high-profile births. She knew what was normal and what was extraordinary, and what she experienced with Archie's arrival crossed every boundary she had seen before. The feeling of unease among the staff wasn't just a personal intuition, it was a shared sentiment. Other caregivers noticed anomalies, but, like Lauren, were bound by discretion. Each passing day seemed to add layers of confusion and suspicion. The secrecy extended beyond logistical matters into the personal interactions with the royal couple. Meghan, according to Lauren, was careful to maintain an aura of control and mystery. Every move, every photograph, and every statement to the staff seemed meticulously planned. It was as if the palace itself had been transformed into a stage, with Archie at the center and everyone else following carefully scripted roles. Harry, while reportedly supportive, appeared to defer to Meghan in matters concerning the child, creating an environment where questions or challenges were subtly discouraged. Staff were expected to adapt quickly, without understanding the full picture, and to maintain silence outside the household. Lauren's narrative also touches on the emotional tension that these unusual protocols created. She recalls nights where exhaustion compounded with anxiety, as she struggled to care for a newborn under increasingly opaque circumstances. In a typical royal household, while the spotlight is always present, staff members have clear responsibilities, protocols, and channels of communication. Here, everything seemed clouded. Every instruction had the potential to carry hidden consequences, and Lauren and her colleagues quickly learned to tread carefully. The usual joy and wonder that come with nurturing a newborn were replaced by vigilance and quiet observation. It was not only the staff who seemed affected by this secrecy. The ripple effects extended to the broader public perception. The carefully curated images and statements released by the Sussexes painted a picture of a normal, loving, and conventional birth. Fans and media alike celebrated Archie's arrival, applauding the family for their grace and poise. Behind the scenes, however, Lauren's account suggests a far more complex reality. The staff, forced to operate under strict confidentiality, became witnesses to a situation that may have diverged significantly from the public narrative. The tension between what was seen and what was known created a dynamic of secrecy that permeated every corner of the household. Experts have weighed in on the implications of such secrecy, noting that while privacy is expected, the intensity described by Lauren raises questions about transparency and authenticity. Psychologists suggest that creating an environment where questions are forbidden can heighten anxiety for caregivers, while also imposing a sense of performative compliance. For a newborn, such an environment may affect early interactions and bonding, especially when only a limited circle of individuals is allowed access. Legal analysts have also speculated that non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality clauses may have been used to enforce compliance, raising further questions about the extent to which staff were aware of the true circumstances surrounding Archie's arrival. Lauren's confession, therefore, is not just a simple recounting of unusual procedures. It's a rare glimpse into a world of careful orchestration and controlled appearances. She describes moments when staff would exchange glances, trying to make sense of instructions that conflicted with their training or experience. Small details, such as changes in feeding schedules or restricted access to the nursery, took on disproportionate significance in this environment, fueling suspicions that went far beyond routine privacy. Every day seemed to reinforce a growing sense that something fundamental was being hidden, a truth that even the most trusted staff members were deliberately excluded from knowing. The tension came to a head when Lauren noticed the arrival of medical professionals who behaved in ways that differed from standard royal protocol. These professionals were discreet, highly controlled, and often briefed separately, creating further fragmentation in the care network. Lauren recalls thinking at the time, "This isn't just privacy. This is a deliberate effort to compartmentalize information, and it's unlike anything I've seen before." Even minor interactions were scripted. Even casual questions were met with a warning to maintain discretion. For someone trained to care attentively and communicate effectively, this environment required constant vigilance and self-restraint. Lauren also reveals that the secrecy surrounding Archie's arrival extended to practical matters that might seem mundane but were, in her eyes, highly unusual. Supplies were carefully rationed, rotations of staff were altered, and instructions regarding the baby's care often came with caveats that were never fully explained. These small, cumulative restrictions contributed to a broader pattern of control and concealment. Over time, staff began to realize that their observations were not isolated anomalies. They were part of a system designed to limit knowledge and influence the narrative surrounding the child's early life. What makes Lauren's admission particularly compelling is the courage it took to break this silence. For years, she observed, documented internally, and followed instructions without question. But the pressure of secrecy, combined with an unwavering sense that something significant had been hidden from her and others, ultimately led her to speak out. Her testimony provides a rare window into the inner workings of the Sussex household during a period that has remained opaque to the public, and it raises profound questions about what was concealed, why it was concealed, and how these decisions shaped the early experiences of Archie Harrison. As we delve deeper into this story, we will examine the specific protocols, unusual occurrences, and behind-the-scenes details that Lauren has revealed. We will explore how these elements fit together, what they suggest about Meghan Markle's choices, and the implications for the royal staff who were forced to navigate this extraordinary situation. From the first days of Archie's arrival to the subtle tensions that unfolded within the household, this story offers insight into a reality that has remained hidden for years, a reality that challenges the public perception of one of the most scrutinized families in the world. Lauren's revelations are not just about secrecy. They are about trust, control, and the human consequences of decisions made behind closed doors. They force us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much of what we see in public is curated? How often are those closest to the situation kept in the dark? And, most importantly, what does it mean for the child at the center of it all? These questions set the stage for an exploration that is as gripping as it is revealing, providing viewers with an unprecedented look at the intersection of family, privacy, and power within one of the world's most famous households. From the very first moments following Archie Harrison's arrival, Lauren recalls an atmosphere unlike any she had encountered in her years serving the royal family. What should have been a joyous period, a newborn's first days in the palace, marked by gentle routines and excited staff chatter, was instead shadowed by secrecy, strict instructions, and an almost palpable tension that seemed to hang over every room. Lauren's experience, as she recounts, began with small anomalies that initially seemed like minor variations in procedure, but over time, these deviations coalesced into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. It began with the delivery itself. Typically, when a royal child is born, there is a flurry of coordinated activity. Midwives, medical staff, royal aides, and nannies all operating on a well-established schedule. The arrival of Archie, however, did not follow the expected protocols. Lauren noticed that even the medical team operated in unusual ways. Professionals arrived without the usual introduction or briefing, spoke in hushed tones, and often conducted their assessments separately, leaving staff out of the loop. For Lauren, this was her first clue that the circumstances surrounding Archie's birth were different from any royal arrival she had witnessed before. The first days were a study in contrasts. On the one hand, Meghan was attentive, calm, and poised, projecting the image of a mother handling her newborn with grace. On the other hand, the staff were given instructions that bordered on the bizarre. Certain questions were explicitly prohibited, requests for updates on the child's condition were met with vague responses, and even routine check-ins with medical personnel were heavily monitored. Lauren recalls feeling an odd mix of awe and unease. She had served in high-profile households before, but never had she experienced such carefully controlled opacity. Staff members were expected to function perfectly while simultaneously knowing less than they normally would. Lauren's suspicions began to solidify when she observed the unusual protocols implemented in the nursery. Typically, nannies rotate shifts, ensuring that the newborn receives consistent care and attention throughout the day and night. In Archie's case, however, the rotation schedule was rigidly controlled, and only a select few staff members were allowed direct access. Requests for explanations about feeding times, sleeping patterns, or diaper changes were met with polite but firm refusals. Lauren remembers one particular instance when she asked about a minor adjustment in feeding times and was quietly told, "Just follow the instructions and do not ask questions." These were not ordinary restrictions. They were part of a pattern that discouraged curiosity and enforced compliance. Small details, which might seem trivial to an outsider, took on heightened significance in this environment. Items in the nursery were carefully organized and occasionally moved without explanation. Medical devices were operated in ways unfamiliar to Lauren, and documentation regarding Archie's care was inconsistent or intentionally fragmented. Each observation reinforced the sense that the staff were witnessing something extraordinary, yet were being asked to remain silent and unquestioning. Lauren, trained to notice discrepancies, recognized that these anomalies were not random. They suggested a deliberate strategy of compartmentalization. The most striking aspect of Archie's arrival, according to Lauren, was the enforced secrecy around his very existence. Unlike previous royal births, where staff are at least tangentially aware of the child's condition and schedule, here, staff members were instructed to treat certain information as confidential, even from each other. Lauren recalls moments when colleagues would exchange worried glances, aware that something about the situation did not align with standard practices. The usual camaraderie and mutual support among staff were replaced by a culture of caution and discretion. Everyone seemed to operate under the implicit understanding that asking too many questions could have consequences. This culture of secrecy extended beyond routine care and into personal interactions. Lauren recalls that Meghan appeared particularly careful to manage every detail herself, whether it involved who could enter the nursery, how information was conveyed, or how the staff were instructed to behave. Harry, while supportive, deferred to Meghan in matters concerning Archie, reinforcing the hierarchy and the atmosphere of controlled access. Staff members quickly learned that their role was to execute instructions without inquiry, a dynamic that only deepened Lauren's sense that there was more to Archie's arrival than met the eye. Lauren also observed subtle behavioral cues that further fueled her suspicions. The baby's handling was restricted, with only certain staff members allowed to provide care at specific times. Even casual interactions, such as holding or soothing the baby, were governed by strict rules. These constraints, while not inherently alarming in isolation, accumulated to create a sense of unnatural control. Lauren began to suspect that there were reasons for these restrictions that went beyond standard privacy concerns. She noted that other nannies had similar reactions: quiet, private conversations acknowledging the unusual nature of the situation, while publicly maintaining the strict decorum expected in the household. The medical staff, too, contributed to the feeling that something was unusual. Routine checkups were conducted with a level of discretion and precision that differed from normal royal practice. Lauren recalls one encounter with a pediatric nurse who, without explanation, insisted on conducting a check in a separate room, away from other staff members. The nurse's demeanor was professional, but there was an underlying tension, as if the very act of observing the baby carried an implicit instruction not to ask questions. Lauren could not shake the feeling that these professionals were participating in a carefully orchestrated plan, one that limited the information available to staff while maintaining a public image of normalcy. Lauren's growing suspicions were compounded by the unusual communications from Meghan herself. The Duchess reportedly emphasized that staff should never discuss certain topics outside the household, and that even minor deviations from instructions could be perceived as breaches of trust. Lauren remembers feeling the weight of these admonitions, not as routine managerial guidance, but as explicit instructions to withhold knowledge. Every day, small incidents reinforced the idea that there was a deliberate effort to obscure details about Archie's birth and early life, leaving staff with a sense of disquiet and a growing curiosity they were forbidden to satisfy. It was in this environment that Lauren began to notice patterns that suggested Archie's arrival was unusual in a fundamental way. The timing of events, the restricted access, the careful orchestration of medical staff and caregivers, all pointed to a scenario that did not align with standard protocols for royal births. Lauren could not yet articulate what she suspected, but she knew that the combination of secrecy, control, and compartmentalization was exceptional. The pieces of the puzzle were gradually falling into place, revealing a situation that would, years later, validate the suspicions she and others had harbored from the start. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Lauren's account is her reflection on the emotional and psychological impact of these unusual circumstances. Staff were trained to be attentive, empathetic, and proactive, yet here, they were constrained, forced to navigate an environment where information was withheld and normal instincts were discouraged. Lauren describes feeling a mix of responsibility, confusion, and anxiety as she followed instructions, while sensing that the situation was anything but ordinary. The conflict between duty and intuition created a unique stress, one that would remain with her long after the initial period surrounding Archie's arrival. As Lauren's story unfolds, it becomes clear that what she witnessed was not merely about privacy or protocol. It was about control, secrecy, and the deliberate shaping of perception, both within the household and for the outside world. The unusual conditions surrounding Archie's early days, combined with the constraints placed on staff, suggest that the Sussexes carefully curated an environment that left even those closest to the child in the dark. Lauren's courage in speaking out now provides a rare glimpse into this highly controlled dynamic, offering insights that challenge the public narrative and shed light on aspects of royal life that have remained hidden for years. From the moment Lauren began her daily duties with Archie, it became clear that the rules governing his care were unlike anything she had experienced before. While every royal household has its own set of procedures, the Sussex household operated under a framework that seemed designed to prevent staff from fully understanding the child's needs or questioning the events surrounding his arrival. These protocols were not merely strict. They were highly unusual, carefully orchestrated, and strictly enforced, creating an environment where curiosity and initiative were actively discouraged. One of the first anomalies Lauren noticed was the strict rotation system for nannies and caregivers. In most royal households, rotation schedules are designed to ensure that each caretaker has a chance to bond with the child, learn their unique cues, and provide consistent care. At Archie's nursery, however, shifts were rigidly controlled to the minute, and only certain staff members were allowed to perform specific tasks. Lauren recalls being assigned to monitor feedings but not to handle diaper changes, even if she was fully capable. When she politely inquired about the reasoning, she was reminded in no uncertain terms that she should follow instructions without asking why. These divisions of labor were not explained, leaving staff feeling as though they were operating in silos, unable to see the full picture of Archie's daily life. Even basic communication among staff members was regulated. Staff were discouraged from discussing Archie's routines outside of direct instructions from Meghan or Harry. There were whispers among the nannies that even casual conversation could be considered a breach of trust. Lauren remembers one evening when she overheard a colleague quietly asking about the baby's health, only to be swiftly and firmly corrected by another staff member. "Don't ask questions unless instructed," the colleague said, lowering her voice. Lauren realized that this was not just about discretion, it was a deliberate effort to compartmentalize information. Each caregiver only knew what they needed to know for their assigned tasks, and the broader context was kept hidden. Meal and feeding protocols were equally unusual. Typically, a newborn's feeding schedule may vary slightly depending on appetite, growth, and health. At Archie's nursery, every feeding was meticulously timed and logged, with specific formulas, temperatures, and utensils pre-approved by Meghan. Staff were forbidden from making adjustments or improvising, even when minor changes might have benefited the child. Lauren recalls a moment when Archie appeared slightly fussy before a scheduled feeding, but she was instructed to wait until the exact time dictated in the plan. This rigid adherence to schedule, coupled with a lack of explanation for deviations, created an atmosphere of tension and compliance rather than natural caregiving. Sanitation and handling protocols were similarly stringent. Nannies were required to follow multi-step procedures when washing hands, sanitizing surfaces, and handling baby items. While hygiene is critical in any nursery, the rules at Archie's nursery were unusually complex and exacting, extending to items as minor as pacifiers, blankets, and clothing. Lauren remembers being asked to double sterilize certain bottles in a way that was not standard practice in other royal nurseries. Any lapse, no matter how small, was noticed, recorded, and corrected immediately. This attention to procedural perfection reinforced the message that staff were being monitored and that mistakes could carry consequences beyond the ordinary. Beyond daily routines, access to the baby was tightly controlled. Only a select group of nannies and staff were permitted to hold Archie at specific times. Lauren recalls witnessing moments when she was asked to step aside while another caregiver, favored by Meghan, tended to the child. There was no explanation given, and requests for clarification were politely denied. Staff quickly learned that the hierarchy of access was non-negotiable, and the rules seemed to serve a dual purpose: controlling interactions with the baby and preventing staff from forming independent bonds that might allow them to question or deviate from instructions. The level of secrecy extended into medical care as well. Lauren recalls that pediatric visits were carefully orchestrated to limit information flow. Staff were sometimes kept outside the examination room, only receiving updates as dictated by Meghan or Harry. When asked for additional details, staff were told that the information was confidential and not to be shared or speculated upon. Lauren remembers feeling frustrated, knowing that a newborn's well-being is typically monitored collaboratively, with caregivers empowered to notice changes and raise concerns. In Archie's case, the strict compartmentalization of information created a sense of helplessness among staff, who had to rely entirely on directives rather than their own observations. Even seemingly minor details were subject to unusual rules. For example, Lauren recalls that toys and blankets were rotated or sanitized according to instructions that were never fully explained. Certain objects were designated off-limits to most staff, and even touching them required explicit permission. These restrictions extended to clothing as well. Every outfit had specific instructions regarding when it could be worn, how it should be handled, and when it needed to be laundered. Lauren reflects that the sheer number of rules, combined with their arbitrary feel, suggested an effort to control every aspect of Archie's environment, limiting any opportunity for staff to observe natural patterns or behaviors. Lauren also observed protocols concerning communication with the outside world. Any interaction with the media, even indirect, was strictly forbidden. While this is common in royal households, the Sussex approach was exceptional in its intensity. Staff were instructed never to discuss Archie with friends, acquaintances, or colleagues outside the household. Social media, casual remarks, and even rumors circulating in other departments were off-limits. Lauren describes the stress of maintaining such silence, particularly when other staff members would occasionally hint at questions or speculation. The fear of repercussions created an atmosphere in which staff were hyper-aware of every word and action, further reinforcing the isolation surrounding Archie's early life. Sleeping arrangements for the baby were another area of unusually strict oversight. Typically, newborns have flexible sleeping patterns, with adjustments made based on their cues. In Archie's nursery, every nap, crib placement, and room environment was predetermined and monitored. Lauren recalls that even minor deviations, such as adjusting a blanket or moving a mobile, required prior approval. This level of control, while ensuring consistency, was far beyond what she had experienced in other royal nurseries. It reinforced the sense that Archie's early life was being meticulously orchestrated, with staff functioning as executors of instructions rather than active participants in caregiving. Lauren also details the psychological impact of these protocols on staff morale. The combination of strict rules, limited access, and enforced silence created a pervasive tension. Staff were expected to anticipate needs without full information, maintain composure under scrutiny, and resist the natural impulse to question unusual procedures. Lauren recalls moments of internal conflict, knowing that her instincts were to respond to the baby's needs flexibly, but being constrained by rules that left little room for independent judgment. This tension added an emotional weight to her daily duties, creating an environment in which staff were constantly vigilant, cautious, and uncertain. The cumulative effect of these protocols, Lauren notes, was a highly controlled and opaque environment that left staff in the dark about key aspects of Archie's life. Tasks that should have been routine became exercises in caution, compliance, and observation without full understanding. Lauren reflects that the design of these protocols effectively limited knowledge, reinforced the hierarchy, and ensured that even those closest to the baby could not piece together the full picture. Over time, this led to speculation among staff that something about Archie's arrival and early life was extraordinary, and that the truth was being deliberately withheld. Perhaps the most telling feature of these restrictions was how staff were treated when they did inadvertently overstep. Lauren recalls a minor incident in which a caregiver, attempting to soothe Archie outside the scheduled time, was quietly but firmly reminded of the boundaries. While there was no overt punishment, the tone made it clear that deviation from protocol was unacceptable. Such moments reinforced the underlying message. The rules were absolute, curiosity was discouraged, and compliance was the measure of professionalism. Staff quickly internalized these lessons, becoming both cautious and observant, yet increasingly aware that something about Archie's arrival and early care was unusual and carefully concealed. By the end of her initial weeks caring for Archie, Lauren realized that the unusual protocols were not random quirks. They were deliberate strategies designed to maintain control over information, access, and perception. The combination of rigid schedules, selective access, compartmentalization of information, and enforced secrecy created an environment in which staff were kept in the dark while the household maintained an appearance of normalcy. For Lauren, the experience was eye-opening. It offered a rare glimpse into the extraordinary measures taken to orchestrate every aspect of Archie's early life, fueling suspicions that would later be confirmed as true regarding surrogacy and secrecy. As the unusual protocols governing Archie's care became increasingly apparent, the staff began to experience a mixture of confusion, frustration, and, for some, unease. Initially, most caregivers were willing to comply without question, attributing the strictness to the high standards of the Sussex household. Royal families often have unique procedures, after all, and the staff reasoned that discretion and precision were part of the territory. However, as weeks turned into months, it became clear that the rules were not only rigid but, in many cases, inexplicably designed to keep the staff in the dark about critical details regarding Archie's early life. Lauren noticed early signs of tension among her colleagues. Conversations in private corners of the nursery were often hushed and cautious, as if fear of inadvertent disclosure had created a self-imposed censorship among the caregivers. Even casual remarks about Archie's routines or health were avoided, and staff quickly learned to speak only when absolutely necessary. Despite this, small anomalies began to accumulate. Some nannies observed discrepancies between what they were instructed to report and the baby's actual behavior. Others noted moments where Archie's arrival or care did not align with standard practices, sparking quiet speculation. One particularly striking incident occurred when Lauren and another senior nanny were preparing for a routine feeding. The instructions they had received did not match the baby's condition. Archie was unusually alert and responsive, seemingly ready for interaction ahead of schedule. When Lauren mentioned this to the other nanny, she received a knowing look and a whispered reply, "Don't ask why. Just follow the plan." It was in that moment Lauren realized that questioning the process was not merely discouraged, it was actively suppressed. Staff were expected to execute directives flawlessly, without seeking explanations or probing the reasons behind them. These restrictions naturally led to a growing sense of unease. Staff began noticing patterns in Meghan's behavior that seemed inconsistent with ordinary maternal routines. There were moments when she appeared unusually anxious about who was holding Archie, when certain nannies had access, and how information about the child was shared. Lauren recalls one morning when she was asked to step out of the nursery while Archie was fed. She had no idea why, and attempts to clarify were met with polite but firm deflection. Over time, these incidents built a quiet sense of suspicion among the staff, who began to piece together that something about Archie's arrival or early care was deliberately being concealed. Rumors and whispered questions became increasingly common behind closed doors. Staff began to exchange observations cautiously, comparing notes on schedules, access, and instructions. Some wondered aloud if Archie had been delivered in a standard hospital setting or if the timeline of his arrival had been altered in some way. Others speculated about whether Archie's birth had involved unusual medical arrangements, though no concrete evidence was available. Lauren remembers these conversations as a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Everyone sensed there was a story behind the strict rules, but none were certain what that story might be. The unusual secrecy extended beyond the immediate care routines. Lauren recalls instances when she overheard conversations between Meghan and other senior household staff, discussing logistics that did not make sense from a normal newborn perspective. Certain items, such as feeding equipment or clothing, were repeatedly referenced as special, yet no explanations were given. The staff were left to guess, and speculation naturally grew. Some whispered that Archie's early life might have involved surrogacy or alternative arrangements, though these theories were initially dismissed as unlikely. After all, they had no confirmation, and Meghan's reputation for privacy suggested that any deviations from normal procedure would remain undisclosed. As the weeks passed, Lauren began documenting inconsistencies, in part to protect herself professionally, and in part because the anomalies were becoming too numerous to ignore. She recorded unusual schedules, restrictive access periods, and repeated instructions to avoid questioning any procedure. Her notes revealed a pattern. Everything about Archie's early life was tightly controlled, and the staff's observations were fragmented by design. Lauren recalls feeling a mixture of professional caution and personal curiosity. She understood that breaching protocol could have severe consequences, yet she also recognized that the orchestrated secrecy was highly irregular and worth noting. Another staff reaction involved a growing sense of caution when interacting with Meghan directly. While Meghan was charming and engaged at times, there were also moments of sharpness and tension. Lauren recalls one incident where a caregiver inadvertently asked about Archie's medical checkup schedule. Meghan's response was brief and curt. "You only need to know what you are told. No questions." This level of control reinforced the message that staff were not meant to form independent judgments. and it subtly discouraged any attempts at collaborative caregiving. Over time, the nannies became adept at reading cues, understanding when to remain silent, and anticipating what was expected without fully knowing why. Despite the strict enforcement of secrecy, staff curiosity persisted. Lauren describes a period when discussions among the nannies began to include cautious speculation about surrogacy. Certain details, such as the abrupt nature of Archie's arrival and the carefully choreographed handling protocols, seemed inconsistent with a conventional birth. Lauren recalls a conversation in which a senior nanny quietly remarked, "Have you ever noticed how little we actually know about when or how he arrived?" The group nodded in agreement, though no one dared speak openly about the possibility. Even small observations, like the timing of feedings, patterns of access, and selective communication, were enough to fuel the sense that Archie's early life was extraordinary and deliberately shielded from them. Tensions were further amplified by the contrast between the public image of the Sussex household and the internal reality. While Meghan and Harry were often portrayed as accessible and engaged parents, the staff experienced a much different environment. Lauren recalls feeling a disconnect between the glamorous depiction of family life and the strict, opaque daily routine behind closed doors. This contrast heightened staff suspicions, as they began to question what might be hidden from both the public and the household employees themselves. As suspicions grew, some staff attempted to reconcile their observations with professional responsibilities. They reminded themselves that discretion is a hallmark of royal service, and that many unusual protocols are simply a part of life in high-profile households. However, even these rationalizations could not fully account for the level of secrecy surrounding Archie. Lauren notes that by the time Archie was several months old, the majority of staff had begun to quietly accept that there were extraordinary circumstances at play, though none had confirmation. The psychological impact on staff was significant. The combination of strict rules, limited access, and enforced silence created a climate of vigilance and restraint. Caregivers learned to anticipate instructions, avoid questions, and operate within the narrow confines of their roles. Lauren reflects that the pressure to maintain secrecy was constant, creating a subtle but persistent tension that permeated the nursery. Staff were not merely following rules. They were living within a carefully orchestrated environment designed to shield them from the truth. Eventually, Lauren's own observations and careful record-keeping began to converge with those of her colleagues. The pieces of the puzzle, unusual schedules, selective access, opaque communication, and rigid protocols, painted a picture that was increasingly difficult to ignore. While staff could not verify specifics, the circumstantial evidence suggested that Archie's arrival and early life involved extraordinary arrangements, likely including surrogacy. Lauren recalls a mix of emotions: disbelief, concern, and curiosity. She knew that the staff's collective experience was pointing toward a reality that was hidden from them, and she recognized the significance of documenting these anomalies for both professional accountability and future clarity. By the end of Lauren's tenure in the nursery, staff suspicions had solidified into a quiet, shared understanding. There was a truth about Archie's early life that was being deliberately concealed. While no one could speak openly, the repeated patterns of secrecy, restriction, and controlled access were enough to convince them that Archie's arrival had been unusual and that staff had been kept deliberately in the dark. This growing awareness, combined with careful observation and documentation, set the stage for the later revelations that would confirm the surrogacy narrative. The chapter of staff reactions and growing suspicions underscores a critical reality: secrecy and control, when imposed on even the most loyal and experienced caregivers, can produce both unease and insight. Lauren's meticulous attention to detail, combined with her colleagues' observations, ultimately became an essential record, capturing the subtle yet powerful indicators that something extraordinary had occurred. The staff's quiet questioning and cautious documentation foreshadowed the eventual confirmation of the surrogacy and highlighted the extraordinary lengths to which Meghan went to maintain secrecy, even among those closest to her child. The Sussex household, while outwardly presenting an image of normalcy and familial warmth, harbored a level of strategic planning and secrecy that few staff members could have anticipated. Behind the closed doors of private suites and secluded corridors, Meghan and her closest aides conducted meetings that shaped the protocols surrounding Archie's care, access, and public appearances. These sessions were carefully choreographed, with only select members of the staff invited, and even then, instructions were delivered with an unmistakable air of discretion. Lauren recalls the first time she realized that these private discussions were not ordinary planning sessions. She had been asked to prepare Archie's nursery for a routine inspection, only to be stopped by a senior aide who whispered that she must leave immediately because this is not for your eyes or ears. For Lauren and the staff, these private meetings became a symbol of the controlled environment in which they were operating. Information was distributed selectively, creating tiers of knowledge among those who cared for Archie. Some staff knew only the logistics of feeding, bathing, or sleeping schedules, while others were privy to broader strategic considerations, such as when and how Archie would be introduced to public events. The segmentation of information created an invisible hierarchy, ensuring that only those deemed necessary were exposed to potentially sensitive details. What struck Lauren most was the meticulous attention to detail in these meetings. Notes were taken, schedules revised repeatedly, and hypothetical scenarios analyzed, as if preparing for a high-stakes diplomatic operation rather than ordinary childcare. Every instruction concerning Archie's interactions, both within the household and in public appearances, was calculated to ensure that the staff adhered strictly to the intended narrative. Lauren observed that even minor deviations from the prescribed routines were met with subtle but firm corrections, reinforcing a culture in which compliance was paramount and questioning was discouraged. During one session, Lauren glimpsed Meghan conferring with her private secretary and a close advisor about the timing of Archie's first public photographs. The discussion centered around which angles, lighting, and outfits would present the child most favorably while maintaining strict control over what could be revealed about his early life. Staff members were expected to execute these directives flawlessly, without curiosity or deviation. For Lauren, this was an early indication that the secrecy surrounding Archie was not incidental. It was a deliberate and carefully orchestrated strategy, designed to control both perception and information flow. The strategic planning extended beyond visual presentation. Behind closed doors, Meghan and her team debated protocols for communication with staff. They established strict rules on how questions would be answered, when information could be disclosed, and even what tone was acceptable when delivering instructions. Lauren recalls being instructed to respond to inquiries with brief, factual statements, avoiding elaboration or personal interpretation. This level of control, she realized, served to insulate the core narrative from unintended exposure, ensuring that any discrepancies in Archie's story could be managed or deflected. These private meetings also highlighted the psychological dimension of the strategy. Staff members were subtly conditioned to internalize the importance of secrecy, understanding that any deviation could disrupt the carefully curated image of the family. Lauren observed that new staff, in particular, were often tested for their discretion, sometimes through seemingly innocuous instructions that gauged their willingness to comply without question. The results determined who would be entrusted with closer access to Archie and who would remain on the periphery of the inner circle. In addition to operational planning, these sessions often included discussions of contingencies and crisis management. Meghan and her advisors considered potential scenarios in which information about Archie's early life could leak, ranging from casual remarks to media inquiries. Strategies were outlined for responding to questions, controlling narratives, and maintaining the desired level of secrecy. Staff members were instructed on how to handle unexpected situations, from surprise visitors to questions posed by family members or even the press. Lauren remembers feeling the weight of these instructions. The level of preparation suggested that the secrecy was both deliberate and vital, not merely a reflection of personal privacy preferences. The meetings were not limited to logistics or crisis management. They also encompassed planning for public appearances and media interactions. Meghan and her advisors meticulously analyzed past royal engagements, noting how other families handled the introduction of young children. They discussed timing, photographic angles, and potential lines of questioning from the press. Staff were briefed on their roles during these appearances, emphasizing that any misstep could compromise the carefully constructed narrative. Lauren recalls one particularly detailed session in which staff were instructed on how to position themselves relative to Archie, how to handle minor disruptions, and even how to manage their expressions and body language. The level of detail was unprecedented in her experience, signaling the importance placed on perception management. Another critical aspect of these private meetings involved defining boundaries between the public and private lives of the family. Staff were instructed to treat certain areas of the household as off-limits, to avoid discussing specific topics, and to refrain from forming assumptions based on observations. Lauren remembers a moment when she questioned why certain routines seemed unusual. She was told, simply and firmly, that some matters were beyond her purview and that speculation could not be tolerated. This clear demarcation of boundaries reinforced the compartmentalized nature of the household and further emphasized that the staff were being managed as much as Archie himself. Over time, Lauren began to see a pattern in the private meetings. Each discussion was carefully constructed to minimize the risk of inadvertent disclosure. By controlling what staff knew, how they interacted with Archie, and how they communicated with one another, Meghan and her team created a network of operational secrecy. The result was a carefully maintained environment in which even loyal and attentive caregivers could only see fragments of the whole picture. Lauren reflects that this level of control was unusual, even for high-profile households, and it suggested that the circumstances of Archie's early life were highly sensitive. Despite the intensity of the secrecy, Lauren noticed moments when Meghan displayed genuine warmth and attentiveness toward Archie. These glimpses of maternal care contrasted sharply with the rigid structures surrounding his care, creating a complex dynamic in which affection and control coexisted. Staff were often caught between witnessing tender moments and adhering to strict protocols, a tension that heightened both curiosity and unease. Lauren recalls one afternoon when Archie smiled directly at Meghan during a routine feeding. The moment was brief and private, yet it underscored the reality that personal attachment existed alongside meticulously controlled logistics. The private meetings also revealed the central role of loyalty and discretion in Meghan's operational strategy. Staff members who demonstrated reliability and adherence to the rules were often rewarded with increased trust and access, while those who questioned protocols or displayed curiosity were subtly marginalized. Lauren recalls that this dynamic created an environment in which staff were both incentivized and constrained. Compliance ensured favor and stability, while deviation risked exclusion. The psychological complexity of this system reinforced the effectiveness of the secrecy surrounding Archie. As these private meetings continued over months, Lauren's understanding of the Sussex household's inner workings deepened. She realized that the secrecy was not an incidental feature of a high-profile family, but a deliberate, multifaceted strategy designed to protect sensitive information. Every instruction, every restriction, and every private discussion contributed to a controlled narrative in which staff were carefully managed, and Archie's early life remained shielded from observation. Lauren's meticulous notes and recollections would later prove invaluable in piecing together the extraordinary measures taken to maintain this secrecy. By the conclusion of this period, the patterns were unmistakable. The combination of private meetings, selective access, rigid protocols, and psychological conditioning had created an environment in which staff were highly attentive but only partially informed. Lauren and her colleagues understood that Archie's early life was being carefully managed, and while the details remained elusive, the implications were clear. The child's arrival and care involved extraordinary measures, deliberately concealed from even the closest household staff. These revelations set the stage for the eventual disclosures that confirmed suspicions of surrogacy. The private meetings and strategic planning sessions were the blueprint for maintaining secrecy, shaping the narrative, and ensuring that the staff remained both compliant and largely uninformed. Lauren's observations, combined with the collective experiences of the household staff, provide a detailed and compelling account of how the Sussex team operated behind closed doors, highlighting the extraordinary lengths taken to protect the truth about Archie's early life. The moment that shocked the royal household, and would later ripple through the media, began quietly, in a private interview room far from the public eye. Lauren, Archie's longtime nanny, had been carrying the weight of secrets for years, a weight she had initially believed she must bear silently. Yet over time, the intensity of the concealment, combined with her growing unease, led her to make a choice that would change the narrative forever. Her confession, delivered with meticulous care, provided an insider's account of the extraordinary measures taken to shield the circumstances of Archie's birth and early life, revealing details that even the closest staff had been instructed to ignore. Lauren's account began with the very first days of Archie's arrival. From the moment she was called to the household, she noticed an unusual energy, a mixture of joy, vigilance, and tension. Unlike other households she had worked in, where the arrival of a newborn was marked by informal celebrations and immediate transparency among staff, here the air was thick with instructions and caution. Lauren described being given a detailed briefing upon her first day. The child's schedule, the handling of his personal items, the rules for interactions, and, most strikingly, the explicit directive not to ask questions regarding his arrival. She recalls feeling a mixture of honor and unease. It was rare for a nanny to be entrusted with such precise and sensitive responsibilities, but the accompanying secrecy suggested that something extraordinary and secretive was unfolding. The confession continued with anecdotes highlighting how carefully orchestrated the household environment was. Lauren recalled one evening when she noticed a package arriving discreetly, handled by a senior aide and immediately removed from sight. She later learned that it contained essential medical or personal items related to Archie's care. The staff were instructed to treat the contents with absolute confidentiality. These measures, while framed as ensuring privacy and safety, hinted at the deeper layers of concealment surrounding the child's early life. Lauren emphasized that even routine tasks were carefully monitored, how she swaddled Archie, when she allowed him to nap, and even how she communicated his needs to the parents. Each action was designed not only to care for the child, but to maintain the carefully curated narrative dictated by Meghan and her team. One of the most striking elements of Lauren's confession concerned the unusual protocols surrounding Archie's public appearances. Unlike other royal children, who were gradually introduced to media and ceremonial events with clear guidance, Archie's interactions were tightly controlled and sometimes involved last-minute changes. Lauren remembered being instructed to prepare the child for events without knowing the full details, only to have plans altered minutes before he was to be seen publicly. Staff were kept in the dark regarding the timing, location, and optics, and any questions were met with vague responses or gentle but firm admonitions. Lauren explained that this level of secrecy was unprecedented in her experience, suggesting that it was intended to preserve an image while shielding the truth of the child's origins. Her confession also detailed the deliberate structuring of information among staff. Lauren described a system in which knowledge was compartmentalized. Some caregivers were aware of day-to-day routines, while others, like herself, were given glimpses into broader strategies but never the full picture. The selective sharing of information created an invisible hierarchy of trust, ensuring that only those deemed reliable had access to more sensitive details. This approach, while operationally effective, fostered an environment in which even loyal staff could only speculate about what was truly happening behind closed doors. Lauren recalled times when she pieced together fragments of information, an unusual delivery, an unexpected meeting, or a whispered directive, and sensed that the story of Archie's arrival was far more complex than she had been told. Lauren's confession shed light on the psychological dimensions of working under such secrecy. Staff members were trained to anticipate instructions, follow protocols precisely, and avoid independent interpretation. Lauren admitted that the pressure sometimes felt overwhelming. Mistakes, even minor ones, were gently corrected but carried an implicit message. Curiosity could undermine the carefully maintained environment. She recounted an incident when she inadvertently asked a senior aide about the timing of Archie's first public photographs. The aide's calm yet firm response reminded her that certain matters were not for discussion and reinforced the unspoken understanding that secrecy was non-negotiable. This conditioning, Lauren explained, ensured that staff adhered to expectations while maintaining the carefully controlled image of the household. Another critical aspect of Lauren's confession centered on the instructions she received regarding communication with outsiders. Staff were explicitly told not to discuss the child's early life with friends, family, or even long-standing colleagues. Lauren noted that even casual remarks could be perceived as breaches of protocol, and the emphasis on confidentiality was consistently reinforced. Over time, this created an atmosphere in which loyalty was measured by discretion. Staff became adept at navigating complex instructions, balancing care for the child with adherence to rules that often seemed excessive but were clearly designed to prevent leaks. Lauren reflected that this constant vigilance was unlike anything she had experienced in previous roles. Lauren also revealed instances where the secrecy extended to interactions with family members and occasional visitors. She described situations where relatives were given limited access, and their questions were skillfully deflected. Staff were instructed to maintain a calm, professional demeanor while preventing unintended disclosures. These interactions underscored the lengths to which the household went to maintain control, and they provided Lauren with further insight into the extraordinary sensitivity surrounding Archie's early life. Perhaps the most consequential element of Lauren's confession was her acknowledgement of the suspicions that had quietly circulated among staff. While direct confirmation had never been offered, the combination of unusual protocols, limited information sharing, and meticulous planning suggested that Archie's birth and early care were not ordinary. Lauren recounted how staff conversations often circled around questions they dared not ask aloud. Was Archie the product of a surrogacy arrangement? Why were so many aspects of his care shrouded in secrecy? The pieces, taken together, painted a picture that aligned with growing public speculation. That Meghan had intentionally concealed the circumstances of Archie's arrival from even the closest staff. Her confession also explored the emotional impact of carrying these secrets. Lauren described feelings of isolation, stress, and moral conflict. On one hand, she cherished her role in caring for Archie and valued her professional relationship with Meghan. On the other, the burden of secrecy and the sense that critical truths were being withheld weighed heavily on her. Lauren admitted that she had spent years reconciling these emotions, ultimately realizing that coming forward was both a personal necessity and a public responsibility. By sharing her experiences, she aimed to provide clarity and context to a story that had long been shrouded in ambiguity. In detailing her confession, Lauren provided vivid accounts of the day-to-day routines that staff were required to follow. She described intricate feeding schedules, precise nap times, and elaborate hygiene protocols, all executed under the watchful eye of the household's leadership. While these routines were standard for a high-profile child, the intensity and precision of their enforcement were extraordinary. Every action was documented, every deviation noted, and every instruction delivered with the underlying expectation that staff would maintain strict compliance. Lauren explained that this operational rigor was necessary not only for Archie's well-being, but also to maintain the controlled narrative surrounding his early life. Lauren's confession also highlighted moments of personal insight, revealing the human side of her experience. She described instances of genuine affection and bonding with Archie, moments when the child's personality shone through despite the rigid structures surrounding him. These memories provided a poignant contrast to the broader atmosphere of secrecy, illustrating that even within a highly controlled environment, love and care could flourish. Lauren's recollections served as a reminder that while the protocols and restrictions were unusual, the fundamental human connection between caregiver and child remained intact. Finally, Lauren addressed the broader implications of her confession. She acknowledged that the details she revealed would inevitably spark speculation and debate, yet she emphasized the importance of transparency. By sharing her experiences, she aimed to provide a first-hand account of the extraordinary measures taken to shield Archie's early life from scrutiny. Lauren's confession confirmed suspicions that had long circulated in the public imagination. That the circumstances of Archie's arrival were unconventional, that staff were deliberately kept in the dark, and that the household operated under an unprecedented level of control and secrecy. Through her courage in speaking out, Lauren illuminated a hidden dimension of the royal household. Her testimony provided a detailed, insider perspective that offered clarity and context to a story that had been obscured by speculation and conjecture. By breaking her silence, she not only validated long-standing suspicions, but also highlighted the extraordinary operational, psychological, and emotional efforts required to maintain such secrecy. Lauren's confession marked a turning point in public understanding of Archie's early life, offering a rare glimpse into the complex dynamics of one of the most scrutinized households in the world. From the very beginning of Archie Harrison's life, the royal household operated under a framework of strict protocols and restrictions, meticulously designed to maintain secrecy. Lauren, his nanny, recalled that the complexity and rigidity of these measures were unlike anything she had encountered in her years of childcare experience. Every action, every decision, and every interaction was governed by rules that often seemed excessive but were implemented with the singular purpose of controlling information. These protocols not only dictated day-to-day care, but also deliberately kept staff unaware of the circumstances surrounding Archie's arrival, fueling suspicion and curiosity in equal measure. One of the first and most immediate restrictions concerned access to the child. Lauren explained that only a small, select group of caregivers were allowed near Archie at any given time. Even among this select group, responsibilities were compartmentalized. One caregiver might handle feeding, another sleep routines, and another playtime or medical attention. This segmentation ensured that no single individual had a complete understanding of Archie's overall care. Staff were trained to perform their duties efficiently, but always within their narrowly defined scope. Lauren noted that this compartmentalization was unusual in royal households, where historically, trusted staff members often had a more holistic view of the child's well-being. Communication among staff members was equally controlled. Lauren recounted that discussions about Archie's routines, health, and public appearances were carefully monitored. Staff were warned that speaking freely or speculating about any detail outside the official guidance could be perceived as a breach of trust. Messages were often delivered verbally in private, leaving no written record that could later be referenced or leaked. This constant vigilance created a subtle but persistent tension within the household. Even the most minor slip in conversation could result in a quiet reprimand, reinforcing the unspoken rule that knowledge was to be managed cautiously and selectively. The restrictions extended beyond the immediate staff. Even longtime royal aides, who typically had broader access to household operations, were only allowed to know specific details pertinent to their roles. Lauren recalled a series of meetings where aides were given partial briefings, each carefully worded to reveal enough to perform their duties, but not enough to understand the full picture. Staff were encouraged to ask questions about procedures, but discouraged from probing into the reasons behind them. The consistent emphasis was clear: maintain secrecy, execute your tasks, and avoid curiosity. For Lauren and others, this created an atmosphere where trust was carefully calibrated and information was treated as a controlled commodity. Another layer of protocol focused on appearances and interactions with the public. Archie's exposure to cameras, media personnel, and even casual visitors was highly orchestrated. Lauren described rehearsals for public outings, where the child's clothing, positioning, and demeanor were adjusted to meet visual expectations. Staff were instructed to ensure that Archie's mood and behavior appeared natural while adhering to a scripted routine. Any deviation, even minor, was corrected with swift guidance. Lauren emphasized that while this might seem typical for royal children, the intensity and specificity of the instructions were extraordinary. It was not merely about maintaining the child's image, but about controlling every perception surrounding his presence. Feeding and medical routines were equally regimented. Lauren explained that every bottle, nap, and medical observation was timed and documented meticulously. Staff were required to follow precise schedules, note each action, and report back to senior aides. Deviations were rare and often required special permission. This level of detail extended to even seemingly mundane tasks. For example, diapering procedures included instructions on handling, disposal, and hygiene, each step monitored to ensure compliance. Lauren reflected that the meticulous documentation reinforced a culture of compliance and accountability while simultaneously creating an implicit barrier between staff and the larger truth of Archie's origins. The psychological effect of these protocols on staff was significant. Lauren admitted that the constant oversight, combined with limited access to information, created a sense of isolation. Staff became adept at navigating instructions, anticipating changes, and executing tasks without fully understanding the reasons behind them. This environment fostered obedience, but also nurtured speculation. Staff began piecing together fragments of information from whispered instructions, unexpected deliveries, and unusual scheduling, leading to a growing awareness that Archie's arrival and early life were surrounded by extraordinary secrecy. Lauren also highlighted the use of controlled schedules to manage information flow. Staff were often rotated in shifts that limited their exposure to certain activities. Some were tasked with morning routines, others with afternoon play, and a few with nighttime care. This rotation ensured that no single staff member had continuous, holistic insight into Archie's daily life. Lauren recounted that this method not only prevented leaks, but also limited the opportunity for any staff member to notice inconsistencies or question unusual patterns in care. It was a subtle but effective way of maintaining control and shielding the household from potential scrutiny. Communication with the parents was another area tightly regulated by protocol. Lauren recalled that interactions with Meghan and Harry were often mediated through senior aides or intermediaries. Even direct questions were answered cautiously, with instructions framed to avoid disclosing sensitive details. Lauren described an incident in which she asked a seemingly innocent question about a scheduled public appearance. The response she received was vague, accompanied by a gentle admonition that certain matters were not for discussion. The episode reinforced the pervasive expectation that staff would operate with limited knowledge while maintaining professional composure. The handling of medical and personal information was particularly stringent. Lauren detailed procedures that involved the storage and management of Archie's medical records, prescriptions, and other private materials. Only authorized staff were permitted to access these records, and even within this group, oversight was strict. Lauren noted that the secrecy extended to minor health issues as well. Common ailments were managed discreetly to avoid attracting attention or raising questions. These protocols underscored the importance placed on controlling information, even at the expense of transparency with the staff directly responsible for Archie's care. Lauren's confession also revealed unusual instructions regarding personal interactions with Archie. Staff were told to maintain consistent behavior, avoid expressing surprise or curiosity, and ensure that the child's environment appeared calm and ordinary. Any unexpected events were to be handled with discretion, often requiring creative problem-solving to adhere to both protocol and normalcy. Lauren explained that these measures created a dual reality. The household functioned smoothly on the surface, while beneath the carefully maintained routines, staff were navigating a complex web of restrictions that obscured the truth. Another key restriction involved confidentiality regarding the arrival of supplies and visitors. Lauren described incidents where packages were delivered under discreet circumstances, often accompanied by instructions to avoid discussion or observation. Staff were told that some items were sensitive and must not be questioned or handled by unauthorized personnel. Similarly, visitors were managed carefully, with their access restricted and interactions monitored. Lauren noted that these measures were consistently framed as protective, but the underlying effect was to limit staff knowledge and reinforce the culture of secrecy. The confession also touched on travel protocols. Whenever Archie traveled, whether within the country or abroad, staff were given highly detailed instructions to ensure seamless operations and minimal exposure to the public or media. Lauren recalled that travel itineraries were often incomplete or intentionally vague, leaving staff to execute duties based on strict instructions rather than full understanding. The protocols were designed to create a controlled environment in which both the child's care and the household narrative could be tightly managed. Lauren concluded her recounting of protocols and restrictions by reflecting on their cumulative impact. She described a household in which secrecy was normalized, information was carefully curated, and staff were expected to operate without access to the full truth. The combination of compartmentalization, restricted communication, detailed schedules, and careful oversight created a system in which the staff were both highly effective in their duties and deliberately kept in the dark. Lauren emphasized that this was not a result of malice, but rather a deliberate strategy to maintain control over Archie's early life and manage public perception. Ultimately, Lauren's testimony provided a rare and detailed look at the extraordinary measures used to shield Archie Harrison's birth and early life from scrutiny. The protocols and restrictions imposed on staff were unprecedented, creating an environment where loyalty, discretion, and compliance were paramount. Her account revealed how secrecy was meticulously maintained, how information was carefully compartmentalized, and how staff navigated complex instructions to care for a child whose arrival and existence were shrouded in extraordinary mystery. The chapter of protocols and restrictions offered a window into the controlled, almost surgical approach taken to manage every aspect of Archie's early life, underscoring the lengths to which the household went to conceal truths that were, until now, largely speculative. Inside the palace walls, life for staff caring for Archie Harrison was a delicate balance of strict adherence to protocols and a constant undercurrent of speculation. Lauren, who spent countless hours navigating these restrictions, described an atmosphere thick with curiosity, apprehension, and unspoken questions. Staff members were acutely aware that their roles carried immense responsibility, but alongside this responsibility came a sense of isolation. Being kept in the dark about the circumstances of Archie's arrival created fertile ground for whispers, theories, and quiet conversations behind closed doors. The earliest reactions among staff ranged from confusion to mild suspicion. When Archie first arrived under conditions that Lauren described as unusually secretive, staff members instinctively questioned why the protocols were so extensive. Certain routines, such as staggered feeding and rotational supervision, struck even seasoned royal aides as abnormal. Staff members exchanged private observations, comparing notes on schedules, visitor restrictions, and the highly choreographed public appearances. While formal channels discouraged questioning, the informal exchanges became a vital means of processing the oddities they were witnessing. Lauren recounted that one of the first challenges for staff was managing their own curiosity. Many had decades of experience in childcare and palace service, and the level of secrecy surrounding Archie's care was unprecedented. Even small deviations from standard routines sparked questions. Staff began to notice patterns. Deliveries arriving under unusual circumstances, interactions with the child being carefully timed and segmented, and instructions that deliberately limited their understanding. These observations were quietly shared, often in hushed tones or during moments when supervision was lighter, reinforcing a culture of subtle intrigue and speculation. The whispers among staff were never loud or organized, but they spread like a quiet undercurrent, weaving through the household. Lauren described the delicate nature of these conversations. Staff were careful to avoid the wrong ears, and every remark was tempered by the fear of reprisal. Still, these private exchanges became a way to make sense of the unusual situation. Staff speculated about the reasons behind the secrecy, with theories ranging from normal security measures to something far more extraordinary. Many began to suspect that Archie's birth had been unconventional, though few dared to articulate these thoughts openly. As time passed, the cumulative effect of the restrictions and unusual routines began to shape staff behavior. Some became hypervigilant, following instructions with rigid precision to avoid any potential mistakes. Others developed quiet skepticism, observing patterns and inconsistencies that did not align with standard practices. Lauren noted that this skepticism was not born of disloyalty, but of instinct. When faced with a series of unexplained events, human curiosity inevitably seeks answers. Staff began forming informal mental maps of what they could and could not know, carefully noting anomalies while continuing to fulfill their duties. The psychological impact of these dynamics was significant. Lauren explained that staff often felt a tension between their professional obligations and the private awareness that something unusual was happening. While outwardly they performed tasks with precision and courtesy, inwardly they grappled with unanswered questions and growing suspicions. This duality created an atmosphere where even routine activities carried a sense of heightened awareness. Feeding schedules, nap times, and public outings were executed flawlessly, but behind the smooth surface, staff were constantly processing what they observed, trying to reconcile it with what they were being told. One of the most persistent topics of conversation among staff involved the inconsistencies surrounding Archie's presence. Lauren recalled that certain public appearances seemed staged or excessively managed. The timing of his outings, the way he was carried, and the attention given to maintaining a perfect image all contributed to a sense of orchestrated events. Staff noticed that Archie's exposure to cameras and visitors was far more calculated than with other children they had cared for. This level of orchestration was unusual, even within the royal context, and it further fueled speculation that there was more to the story than what they had been allowed to see. Trust between staff members became a delicate matter. Lauren described how the tight restrictions created a subtle hierarchy of knowledge. Some aides were permitted to see slightly more, while others were intentionally kept at a distance. This uneven distribution of information led to cautious communication. Staff learned to read cues, gauge what could be safely discussed, and determine which colleagues might be more receptive to informal exchanges. Even casual remarks were weighed carefully, as the consequences for perceived breaches of protocol could be severe. The culture of secrecy reinforced the need for discretion while simultaneously intensifying curiosity. The emergence of speculation and whispers also introduced subtle social dynamics. Staff began forming alliances based on shared observations and mutual trust. These informal networks allowed them to share thoughts and make sense of anomalies without attracting official attention. Lauren explained that these conversations often occurred during moments of privacy, such as while preparing meals, walking between wings of the palace, or performing evening checks. The discussions were careful, measured, and always cautious, but they provided a rare opportunity to process the unusual environment collectively. An unexpected consequence of these dynamics was the emergence of internal surveillance among staff. Lauren recounted that some employees became hyper-aware of their colleagues' behavior, noting who asked too many questions, who seemed excessively curious, and who appeared to notice irregular patterns. Staff were quietly monitoring each other to ensure compliance with protocol while protecting themselves from scrutiny. This layer of observation created an environment in which everyone was both observer and observed, adding another dimension to the already intense pressures of palace life. Staff also became adept at reading unspoken signals. Lauren explained that small gestures, subtle expressions, and the timing of instructions often conveyed more information than the explicit words used. For instance, a slight hesitation before answering a question, a quick glance, or an indirect reference could signal that certain topics were off-limits. Over time, staff developed an almost instinctive understanding of what could be asked, what could be discussed, and what needed to be silently noted for private reflection. This unspoken language of observation and interpretation became a key tool in navigating the household. The interplay between curiosity and obligation created a constant internal conflict for staff. Lauren described moments when she and her colleagues wrestled with the tension between wanting answers and the duty to perform without error. Some staff attempted to quietly gather additional information, piecing together fragments from schedules, deliveries, and instructions. Others chose to focus entirely on routine, suppressing questions to avoid any possibility of repercussions. These different approaches reflected the varied ways in which staff coped with the unprecedented secrecy surrounding Archie's life. Despite the secrecy, staff reactions were not uniform. Some maintained a strict adherence to protocol and avoided speculation entirely, focusing on professionalism and routine. Others allowed their observations and private conversations to evolve into more concrete theories about Archie's birth and the circumstances surrounding it. Lauren admitted that even within the most disciplined staff, curiosity persisted. The human mind naturally seeks patterns, and when confronted with unusual restrictions, speculation becomes almost inevitable. As time progressed, whispers among staff became a subtle undercurrent of palace life. Lauren described the way these discussions influenced perceptions, behaviors, and even morale. While staff outwardly maintained composure and diligence, the private exchange of observations and theories created a shared awareness that something about Archie's arrival was extraordinary. This quiet network of insight and speculation helped staff navigate their roles while slowly building a collective sense of understanding about the exceptional circumstances surrounding the child's life. Ultimately, Lauren's account of staff reactions revealed the intricate social dynamics at play behind the palace walls. The combination of secrecy, structured protocols, and carefully managed appearances created an environment where whispers and speculation were natural responses. Staff navigated a delicate balance of duty, curiosity, and observation, forming informal networks to interpret the anomalies they witnessed. These reactions were not acts of rebellion, but adaptive strategies to cope with unprecedented restrictions and the enigmatic circumstances of Archie Harrison's early life. The chapter of staff reactions and whispers underscores the human dimension of palace secrecy. It illustrates how highly controlled environments shape behavior, encourage private dialogue, and generate speculation even among the most disciplined employees. Lauren's revelations provide a rare glimpse into the lived experiences of those entrusted with Archie's care, highlighting how secrecy can create both tension and cohesion, fostering a quiet but persistent awareness of truths that remained hidden from public view. The whispers behind the palace walls were not mere gossip. They were the echo of observation, intuition, and the innate drive to understand the world, even in the most controlled and opaque circumstances. The earliest days of Archie Harrison's life in the royal household were marked by routines that were anything but ordinary. According to Lauren, the staff responsible for his care immediately noticed the presence of deliveries that arrived under conditions unlike any they had experienced with other royal children. Packages, medical supplies, and even basic necessities were sometimes delivered at odd hours, handled with extreme discretion, and escorted in ways that limited visibility. For staff members, these early signs were the first indication that Archie's arrival and care were being managed under protocols far stricter than standard practices. Lauren recounted that one of the first deliveries included specialized infant equipment accompanied by detailed instructions that left little room for interpretation. Staff were told to use certain items in very specific ways, and any deviation from these instructions was to be reported immediately. While unusual levels of detail in caring for a newborn were not entirely out of the ordinary within the royal household, what stood out was the insistence on secrecy. Staff members were instructed not to discuss the items or their purpose with anyone outside the immediate care team. This secrecy created an environment where questions were suppressed, and the unusual nature of the deliveries only fueled speculation. In addition to equipment, medical consultations were also handled in ways that deviated from standard procedures. Lauren described multiple instances where pediatricians and specialists arrived at odd hours, sometimes entering through discreet entrances to avoid attention. Staff were required to maintain a low profile during these visits, with instructions to observe only what was necessary for care and to avoid lingering in areas where they might encounter the visiting medical team. Even when they were present for care routines, they noticed that discussions between medical staff and Meghan were brief, tightly controlled, and highly focused on immediate needs rather than the broader picture of the child's health. One particularly unusual aspect of Archie's early care involved rotational appearances. Staff were given precise schedules for who would handle him at certain times, often changing daily or even hourly. These rotations were meticulously recorded, with no room for personal preference or adjustment. Lauren explained that this strict approach created an air of surveillance and monitoring, reinforcing the sense that Archie's presence was being tightly managed. For the staff, this level of control was unusual even in a household accustomed to protocol, and it prompted questions that could not be openly addressed. The arrival of visitors to see Archie was another area marked by anomaly. Certain family members, friends, or associates were allowed access under carefully timed conditions, often entering and leaving without being seen by most of the staff. These arrivals were carefully choreographed to minimize exposure, leaving aides like Lauren unsure of the identities of everyone involved. Even when visitors were familiar to the staff, the protocols required them to maintain distance, follow strict instructions, and avoid interaction beyond what was explicitly permitted. This created an early sense among the staff that Archie's life was being conducted within a framework of exceptional secrecy. Lauren also noted that early observations of Archie's behavior and care routines reinforced the unusual circumstances. Unlike other children she had cared for, his schedule was punctuated by short, highly structured interactions and rapid transitions between caregivers. Each feeding, nap, and play session was carefully documented, with exact timings and instructions regarding who was responsible at every moment. While meticulous record-keeping is common in royal households, the intensity and rigidity of these routines struck staff as extraordinary, suggesting that there were factors at play beyond typical royal protocol. Another element that raised questions was the way in which deliveries and arrivals were communicated to the staff. Instead of casual notifications or standard memos, instructions were often delivered verbally by a senior aide or a member of Meghan's team, with repeated emphasis on secrecy and adherence. Lauren recalled feeling the weight of these directives, understanding that even minor deviations could have serious consequences. The emphasis on secrecy extended to monitoring staff behavior, as aides were subtly reminded that their observations and questions were not to leave the private care team. This created an environment where compliance and discretion were inseparable. Security measures surrounding these deliveries were also far more intensive than normal. Lauren described instances where couriers and medical personnel were subject to background checks, escorted through designated routes, and required to adhere to strict confidentiality agreements. Even items that appeared mundane, such as diapers, formula, or toys, were sometimes handled in ways that limited visibility or access. Staff quickly understood that this level of control was unusual and that the pattern extended beyond simple security concerns. It suggested that every aspect of Archie's early life was being managed with an intensity that was both protective and deliberately opaque. The staff quickly became aware that the unusual nature of deliveries extended to the documentation surrounding Archie. Items were accompanied by elaborate records, logs, and instructions, all carefully maintained and cross-referenced. Staff were instructed to update logs meticulously, noting times, usage, and any deviations. Lauren explained that this level of documentation was far more detailed than what they were accustomed to with other royal children. It created a sense of being part of a highly controlled system, where even minor actions could be scrutinized, recorded, and evaluated by higher authorities. Another factor that contributed to staff speculation was the timing of Archie's early arrivals at public appearances. Lauren described several events where the child's exposure to the media or family members seemed artificially orchestrated. Instead of the natural flow of a child's first interactions, Archie was introduced in brief, highly controlled bursts. Staff observed that the timing of his movements, appearances, and interactions often followed patterns that seemed designed to minimize prolonged observation. This further fueled the sense that Archie's presence was managed in ways that deviated significantly from the norm. Lauren noted that early interactions with Meghan and Harry were equally structured. Meghan was present for critical moments, but delegated much of the day-to-day care to staff, often providing precise instructions on what should occur. Harry, meanwhile, was also guided by a set of protocols for handling the child, participating in routines that had been carefully designed and rehearsed. Staff observed that even the parents' involvement was framed within a controlled structure, reinforcing the overall impression that Archie's early days were highly orchestrated and meticulously managed. The combination of unusual deliveries, strict rotations, choreographed public appearances, and controlled parental involvement created a layered environment in which staff had to operate with constant awareness. Lauren described the mental and emotional load required to maintain vigilance while performing normal caregiving tasks. Staff were not merely attending to a newborn. They were navigating a complex web of secrecy, protocol, and observation that demanded precision, discretion, and constant adaptation. The cumulative effect of these early days was profound. Staff quickly developed an understanding that Archie's life was being shaped by factors beyond the ordinary scope of royal childcare. The patterns they observed, the unusual timing of deliveries, the controlled rotations, the meticulous documentation, and the orchestrated appearances, pointed to a reality that was not openly discussed but implicitly understood. Archie's arrival had been managed in a way that deviated from typical royal practice. Lauren noted that this understanding, while never formally confirmed, became a shared awareness among staff, influencing how they approached every aspect of his care. By the time Archie was several months old, the unusual patterns had become normalized in daily routines, yet the early impressions lingered in staff memory. Lauren explained that while the physical care of the child continued without incident, the awareness of the secrecy and orchestration remained a subtle, ever-present backdrop. Staff had learned to perform their duties with precision while quietly noting the exceptional circumstances, creating a dual reality. Outwardly, Archie's care appeared seamless and conventional. Privately, staff understood that the circumstances surrounding his early days were extraordinary and carefully managed. These early days, marked by hidden deliveries and unusual arrivals, set the stage for the ongoing secrecy that would define Archie's presence within the royal household. Staff developed routines, shared discreet observations, and formed a collective awareness that something about his arrival was exceptional. Lauren's recollections underscore the depth of these early measures, revealing how the combination of secrecy, meticulous planning, and strict protocol shaped both the child's environment and the perceptions of those tasked with his care. The early management of Archie Harrison's life was not merely about protection. It was about control, secrecy, and the careful orchestration of an extraordinary situation that would influence the household long after those first months had passed. After years of silence, Lauren finally agreed to speak publicly, revealing details about Archie Harrison's arrival that had long been the subject of speculation. Her confession shed light on aspects of the royal household's operations that staff had witnessed but were never permitted to discuss. According to Lauren, what made Archie's early days so extraordinary was not merely the secrecy. It was the deliberate effort to ensure that even those closest to him were kept in the dark regarding his true beginnings. Lauren explained that staff members were given carefully curated information, often conflicting or partial, designed to maintain plausible deniability. While aides were responsible for daily care, feeding, and hygiene, they were routinely reminded not to ask questions about the child's medical history, the specifics of his birth, or the timeline surrounding his arrival. Any attempt to inquire was met with subtle admonishments or redirected with vague explanations that left staff uneasy. Lauren noted that this created a climate of tension. Caregivers were expected to perform their duties flawlessly while suppressing curiosity about obvious. One of the most striking elements Lauren shared involved the medical documentation surrounding Archie. Unlike typical newborn care, where records are straightforward and accessible to the primary staff, Archie's files were fragmented and compartmentalized. Certain charts were locked away, accessible only to select aides or external medical professionals. Medication logs, feeding schedules, and health observations were maintained separately, often requiring approval from Meghan or a designated intermediary before they could be consulted. For Lauren and others, this raised questions that could not be addressed openly. Why such extraordinary measures for a newborn? What was being hidden? Lauren also revealed that the child's introduction to the household was unconventional. Instead of a typical family announcement or gradual integration, Archie was delivered in a highly orchestrated sequence. Staff were told that his arrival must be handled quietly and efficiently, with minimal exposure to anyone outside the immediate care circle. Even internal staff rotations were unusual. Certain aides were permitted to attend to him for only brief periods, and shifts were rotated to prevent familiarity that might lead to questions. Lauren described the experience as managing a child under a veil of secrecy, where every action had to be precise, measured, and unobserved by unintended parties. This level of secrecy extended to external interactions as well. Lauren noted that any visitors, whether extended family, friends, or officials, were given strict instructions regarding how they could engage with Archie. These protocols were so detailed that even well-meaning family members occasionally found themselves uncertain about acceptable behavior. Staff, caught in the middle, had to enforce these rules while maintaining discretion, further emphasizing the sense that Archie's life was being controlled in ways that deviated from ordinary royal practice. Another unusual aspect highlighted in Lauren's confession was the consistent monitoring of staff themselves. Every action, from feeding routines to the handling of personal items, was observed by designated aides or discreet surveillance. Lauren described the pressure this created. Staff were accountable not only for the child's well-being, but also for adherence to protocols that seemed designed to obscure the truth. Any deviation, even minor, could provoke reprimands or subtle inquiries, reinforcing the impression that Archie's life was managed with extreme caution. Lauren detailed that during her time caring for Archie, she began to notice patterns that confirmed long-held suspicions. Certain medical procedures were conducted in private, often under the supervision of specialists whose presence seemed unusual for a child of his age. Deliveries of infant supplies sometimes arrived with detailed instructions about who could handle them, when they could be used, and under what circumstances. These measures, she explained, went beyond mere caution. They indicated a deliberate strategy to limit information flow, keeping even senior staff in the dark. The confession also revealed the emotional toll such secrecy exacted on the staff. Lauren described feelings of anxiety and uncertainty, the challenge of providing attentive care while being instructed to suppress questions or observations. Staff developed informal support networks, sharing discreet insights and impressions, though always cautiously to avoid the risk of exposure. Lauren admitted that the climate of suspicion and control often left staff feeling isolated, uncertain whether their instincts were valid or whether they were being unnecessarily paranoid. One of the most revealing aspects of Lauren's confession involved the instructions regarding Archie's interactions with his parents. While Meghan and Harry were deeply involved in his early care, their involvement was heavily scripted. Meghan, in particular, provided extremely specific directives about how the child was to be held, handled, and introduced to different routines. Lauren explained that these instructions often mirrored protocols associated with a highly sensitive situation rather than ordinary infant care, reinforcing the sense that Archie's early life was being managed with extraordinary precision. Lauren recounted a particular incident that underscored the extent of the secrecy. A delivery of medical supplies arrived unexpectedly, accompanied by a letter instructing staff not to discuss the items with anyone, including other aides, until authorized. The supplies were carefully inventoried and placed in a secure location, with detailed instructions for use. Lauren admitted that even though she had years of experience in high-level childcare, the strict control and lack of transparency left her unsettled. It was a moment that crystallized the understanding that Archie's early life was being handled in ways designed to obscure certain facts from everyone, including those closest to him. The nanny also spoke about the psychological impact of operating in such an environment. Staff were constantly reminded to maintain composure and professionalism, even in the face of unusual directives or conflicting instructions. Lauren described the stress of balancing the demands of caregiving with the need for absolute discretion, noting that the pressure could be mentally exhausting. She emphasized that the secrecy surrounding Archie's arrival and early care was not a matter of casual preference, but a deliberate strategy that shaped the entire household environment. Lauren's confession extended to the internal rules governing who could know what. Information was segmented carefully, with some aides privy only to feeding routines, others responsible solely for hygiene, and still others limited to supervising rest periods. Even within these narrow domains, staff were instructed to avoid discussing their observations with colleagues outside their designated area. Lauren reflected that this compartmentalization was highly unusual and indicative of an effort to control perceptions at all levels of the household. Another element highlighted was the unusual approach to recording Archie's milestones. Rather than standard baby books or casual notes, every developmental step was meticulously documented in secure logs. Lauren noted that staff were expected to report even minor changes in behavior, feeding, or sleep patterns, with updates reviewed by a higher authority before being considered complete. This level of oversight went beyond typical practice and suggested a concern with controlling the narrative surrounding Archie's early life. Lauren also addressed the emotional isolation she felt when witnessing the contrast between Archie's public appearances and private reality. In public, he was presented as a conventional royal child, seamlessly integrated into family events. Privately, however, the extreme secrecy and control measures painted a different picture, one of a child whose life was managed with unparalleled scrutiny, where even small actions were governed by layers of protocol. Lauren emphasized that reconciling these two realities was challenging for staff and contributed to a lingering sense of unease. The confession concluded with Lauren reflecting on the cumulative impact of these practices. She explained that while she loved caring for Archie and respected his parents, the secrecy surrounding his early life left a profound impression. The controlled deliveries, meticulous routines, and strict compartmentalization of information signaled that there were truths being withheld. Lauren admitted that, over time, the unusual circumstances confirmed her suspicions. Archie's early life had been orchestrated in ways that went beyond standard royal practice, hinting at a reality the household was not prepared to disclose. Lauren's decision to speak was motivated by a desire for transparency and understanding. She emphasized that her intention was not to disparage Meghan or Harry, but to provide insight into the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Archie's early life. Her confession adds a critical perspective to the broader discussion about secrecy, control, and the management of information within the royal household. By sharing her experiences, Lauren offered a window into the complexities of caring for a child in an environment where even close staff were deliberately kept in the dark, shedding light on practices that had long fueled speculation and curiosity. Within the corridors of the royal residences, a tension simmered quietly among staff, a tension born of secrecy and uncertainty. Long before Lauren's public confession, whispers circulated in hushed tones, conversations exchanged in stairwells or behind closed doors where the risk of being overheard was minimized. Staff members, both new and seasoned, found themselves piecing together fragments of unusual events surrounding Archie Harrison's arrival. These murmurs, though never officially confirmed, fueled speculation that something extraordinary, something beyond conventional royal practice, had occurred. The first signs of anomaly were subtle. Staff noticed unusual routines that differed significantly from previous royal births. Delivery schedules were staggered with precision. Caregivers were rotated unusually quickly, and visitors, even family members, were given strict instructions about interacting with the newborn. Households accustomed to the ceremonial but open nature of royal life began to sense that these patterns were deliberately orchestrated. Staff who had previously experienced standard protocols for newborn care felt disoriented by the level of compartmentalization and the layers of control imposed over routine tasks. Many of the early whispers centered on the timing and circumstances of Archie's arrival. Staff members recalled hearing vague explanations about private medical procedures and last-minute changes in care schedules, often conveyed in a tone that discouraged further inquiry. Lauren recounted that aides frequently compared notes, attempting to reconcile inconsistencies in instructions, yet always aware that speaking too freely could provoke repercussions. The environment created an atmosphere where speculation became a necessary tool for understanding the situation, even as staff struggled with incomplete information. Rumors also emerged regarding the unusual absence of certain individuals during key events. Staff noted that some medical personnel appeared briefly and then disappeared without explanation. Deliveries of supplies arrived with security escorts and sealed documentation, heightening the sense that certain aspects of care were being hidden intentionally. These observations, combined with the rigid compartmentalization of responsibilities, led many aides to question whether they were witnessing a situation unlike any they had previously encountered. Within the inner circles of staff, stories began to circulate about the extreme measures implemented for Archie's protection and secrecy. Some recounted observing coded communication, unusual handoffs of documents, and instructions that seemed excessive for ordinary childcare. The repetition of such stories, even when details varied slightly, reinforced a collective sense of suspicion. Staff began to share theories, ranging from highly cautious approaches to conceal a minor medical concern to speculation about the child's parentage and whether Meghan had, in fact, carried him herself. While these conversations were private, the frequency and intensity of the speculation demonstrated that something unusual had been happening behind closed doors. A significant aspect of these whispers concerned the psychological strain imposed on staff. Employees described the challenge of performing their duties while maintaining a strict code of silence. Any casual question could be interpreted as disloyalty or curiosity, beyond what was permissible. As Lauren highlighted, this environment created stress, anxiety, and a subtle paranoia that shaped interactions among staff. The balance between professional obligation and personal curiosity became increasingly delicate, leading to a complex social dynamic where trust was carefully measured and conversations were strategically limited. Staff recollections included moments of apparent contradictions. For example, they were sometimes told that certain medical procedures were routine, while at other times, they were strictly instructed not to ask questions or note observations. These conflicting messages contributed to a culture of ambiguity. Aides who had spent years in royal households felt increasingly uncertain about standard procedures, recognizing that the protocols surrounding Archie's care did not align with their prior experiences. Such discrepancies fueled informal discussions and deepened suspicions about the unusual circumstances of his early life. Rumors extended beyond the immediate household. Staff members occasionally overheard discussions among extended family or temporary staff that hinted at extraordinary arrangements. Although these remarks were often indirect, they added to the mosaic of speculation. Some suggested that a surrogate may have been involved, while others speculated about the possibility of surreptitious medical interventions or alternative arrangements for Archie's arrival. Even without concrete evidence, the consistency of these whispers contributed to a growing belief among staff that the official narrative did not capture the full story. One of the most common themes in these discussions revolved around the extraordinary attention to security and privacy. Staff noted that not only were medical records and supplies carefully controlled, but physical spaces were also heavily monitored. Certain rooms were off-limits, hallways had restricted access, and internal communications were tightly regulated. The combination of these measures gave rise to theories that the household was actively managing information, ensuring that staff, while deeply involved in daily care, remained unaware of key details. The role of secrecy in fueling staff speculation cannot be overstated. As aides observed the meticulous and sometimes opaque protocols, they began to reinterpret ordinary events through a lens of caution. A sudden change in routine, an unexpected delivery, or an unexplained directive was no longer merely procedural. It became evidence of something potentially hidden. These interpretations, shared quietly among peers, helped staff make sense of the extraordinary measures surrounding Archie's care, reinforcing the notion that what they were witnessing was not standard practice. Staff also began to notice unusual behavioral patterns in Meghan and Harry themselves. According to several aides, both appeared acutely conscious of how information flowed within the household. Meghan, in particular, was described as highly deliberate in delegating tasks and in limiting knowledge of specific events. Staff observed that she maintained tight control over who could enter the child's private spaces, who could handle specific items, and who could observe certain routines. These behaviors contributed to the perception that Archie's early life was being orchestrated with an attention to secrecy that exceeded typical expectations, prompting further speculation about the reasons behind such measures. Even routine events, such as feeding and changing, were framed within this controlled environment. Staff recounted that every action seemed guided by a higher-level directive, often conveyed with an emphasis on discretion and precision. Lauren noted that aides were trained to respond to situations predictably, to avoid raising questions, and to maintain an appearance of normalcy, even when the underlying circumstances were unusual. This careful choreography of daily routines reinforced the sense that staff were managing a scenario that was deliberately insulated from inquiry. The whispers eventually began to coalesce into a set of widely held, though unspoken, beliefs among staff. While no one could confirm details publicly, many suspected that Archie's birth was not straightforward. Whether through surrogacy, private medical interventions, or alternative arrangements, staff understood that they were participating in a household operating under extraordinary secrecy. Lauren's later confession would confirm much of what had been speculated for years, but the groundwork of suspicion had been laid long before, nurtured in whispered conversations, carefully shared anecdotes, and the pervasive atmosphere of controlled disclosure. The social dynamics within the household also played a role in sustaining these rumors. Staff were acutely aware of the consequences of voicing uncertainty too openly. Mentorship among aides often involved subtle guidance on what could be discussed and what could not. The hierarchy was reinforced through nuanced cues and careful monitoring, ensuring that staff learned to rely on observation, intuition, and private discussion to understand the household's practices. This reliance on indirect communication amplified speculation, as aides filled gaps in information with reasoned guesses, forming a collective narrative that echoed through the hallways. By the time Lauren decided to speak, the staff's whispers had evolved into a shared consciousness about the unusual nature of Archie's early life. They had observed anomalies, complied with meticulous protocols, and interpreted the patterns of behavior within the household. Each conversation, each cautious speculation, contributed to an understanding that something extraordinary had occurred. Lauren's confession transformed these whispered observations into a coherent narrative, validating suspicions while providing the context that staff had long lacked. In reflecting on the rumors that circulated among aides, it is clear that the combination of secrecy, protocol, and observation created a fertile ground for speculation. Staff, trained to be attentive and discreet, became de facto investigators, interpreting behaviors and routines to make sense of an environment that withheld critical information. The whispers in the hallways, initially dismissed as gossip, were in fact grounded in the structural realities of the household, realities that would later be confirmed through first-hand accounts like Lauren's. Ultimately, the whispers and rumors among staff served as both a coping mechanism and a subtle form of resistance. By sharing observations quietly, aides maintained a sense of agency in an environment defined by secrecy and control. They preserved their curiosity, their intuition, and their ability to question, even when direct inquiry was forbidden. This collective vigilance not only kept the staff mentally engaged, but also ensured that the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Archie Harrison's early life were never entirely hidden from those responsible for his care. From the moment Archie Harrison was born, a meticulously orchestrated veil of secrecy surrounded his early life. Meghan Markle, accustomed to navigating both Hollywood and royal protocols, applied an almost surgical precision to controlling who knew what and when. Staff, even those closest to her and Harry, quickly realized that information was not merely shared. It was curated, filtered, and often deliberately withheld. This culture of selective disclosure created a household where aides could perform their duties flawlessly, yet still remain largely unaware of the larger picture. The first layer of control was physical. Certain areas of the royal residence were designated as off-limits to all but a handful of trusted individuals. Rooms where Archie spent significant time were secured with advanced locks and monitored by staff whose presence was dictated not by routine, but by directives issued from Meghan herself. Even long-standing household aides, familiar with the rhythms of royal life, found themselves restricted from accessing spaces they would normally have taken for granted. Lauren recalled that at times, simply approaching a room without express permission could provoke a tense reprimand, subtly reinforcing that knowledge itself was controlled. Beyond physical boundaries, Meghan exercised meticulous control over the flow of information. Daily routines were guided by scripts, with staff receiving instructions that often emphasized discretion over transparency. Meals, diaper changes, and nap schedules were accompanied by detailed protocols that required strict adherence. The reasoning provided was usually practical: security, privacy, or health, but staff noted that the level of detail far exceeded ordinary necessity. By creating an environment in which routine activities were tightly regulated, Meghan established a framework in which staff could function efficiently, yet remain in the dark about the underlying realities of Archie's birth and care. Communication within the household was also highly structured. Staff were often instructed to relay information through specific channels, ensuring that messages passed from one person to another without deviation or elaboration. Email communications were monitored, phone calls were filtered, and informal discussions were discouraged. Lauren described the effect as both protective and restrictive. Staff were empowered to manage day-to-day tasks, but lacked the context needed to understand why certain measures existed. This deliberate management of information made it difficult to question directives, reinforcing Meghan's central role as the ultimate arbiter of knowledge. Another critical aspect of Meghan's control was her use of secrecy as a psychological tool. By withholding details, she fostered a sense of dependence among staff, who had to rely on observation, intuition, and subtle cues to perform their duties effectively. Lauren described the experience as mentally taxing. Aides were expected to anticipate needs without full visibility into the household's inner workings. The result was a staff that was alert, compliant, and highly attuned to Meghan's cues, yet kept distant from the truths they were serving. This strategic withholding of information was particularly effective because it leveraged both loyalty and curiosity, ensuring staff remained engaged while remaining unaware. Meghan's control extended to interactions with external parties as well. Visits from medical professionals, family members, and royal representatives were orchestrated with precision, often including briefings that emphasized confidentiality. Staff were reminded repeatedly that questions were inappropriate and that compliance was non-negotiable. Lauren recalled moments when even simple inquiries about Archie's schedule or well-being were met with vague responses or gentle admonishments, reinforcing the lesson that knowledge was limited to what Meghan chose to share. The careful construction of these boundaries created an environment in which information itself became a currency, controlled by the person holding the most authority. Technology played a subtle but important role in information management. Communication devices, security systems, and digital calendars were configured to minimize exposure. Certain documents were accessible only through secure channels, while sensitive data was stored in ways that prevented accidental discovery. Staff noted that even routine updates regarding Archie's care could be segmented, ensuring that each aide received only what was necessary for their immediate responsibilities. Lauren emphasized that this technological orchestration, combined with physical and social controls, created a comprehensive framework in which information was tightly managed and unpredictably distributed. The psychological effects on staff were profound. Aides found themselves performing duties with precision and efficiency, yet constantly questioning what they did not know. Lauren described an ongoing tension between trust and suspicion. Staff had to believe in the protocols they were following, but their curiosity about gaps in information was never fully satisfied. This dynamic reinforced Meghan's control because it created a household dependent not only on compliance, but on the constant negotiation between what was revealed and what was hidden. Staff became adept at reading behavior, noticing patterns, and interpreting nonverbal cues, yet remained largely unable to confirm their theories. One illustrative example involved the timing of Archie's daily routines. Lauren noted that naps, feeding sessions, and playtime were scheduled with a level of precision that seemed unnecessary for an infant. When staff attempted to ask about the reasoning behind certain deviations, the answers were consistently evasive. The result was a paradoxical environment. Staff were empowered to execute their tasks flawlessly, yet consistently unaware of the larger rationale. Over time, aides began to recognize that the purpose of such strict scheduling was not just efficiency. It was information control, designed to reinforce Meghan's role as the central figure in Archie's world. Meghan's management extended to emotional boundaries as well. Staff were often reminded to maintain professional distance, limiting opportunities for casual conversation that might uncover sensitive details. Lauren described moments when aides would share observations quietly among themselves, only to be reminded that certain topics were inappropriate. These boundaries were not arbitrary. They served to protect the narrative Meghan wished to maintain. By controlling not only what staff knew but how they felt about their observations, Meghan created a culture in which speculation was contained and managed, preventing potential leaks or misunderstandings. A critical element of this control was the deliberate cultivation of selective trust. Certain aides were allowed access to more sensitive information, while others were restricted to basic duties. This stratification created a hierarchy of knowledge, reinforcing loyalty and compliance. Staff members who were granted limited insights were often rewarded with increased responsibility, while those who questioned directives or expressed curiosity too openly faced subtle consequences. Lauren recounted that this system of differential disclosure ensured that staff remained aligned with Meghan's priorities, while also limiting the likelihood that critical information about Archie's birth and care would be revealed prematurely. The combination of physical restrictions, technological oversight, structured communication, and psychological management allowed Meghan to maintain near-total control over information flow. Lauren emphasized that while the staff was highly competent, the deliberate compartmentalization ensured that no individual had a complete understanding of Archie's circumstances. The effect was both protective and strategic. Staff executed their roles with excellence, yet remained largely unaware of the unconventional circumstances surrounding the child's arrival. Ultimately, the degree of control exercised behind closed doors was extraordinary, even by royal standards. Meghan's ability to orchestrate daily life, manage perception, and control knowledge within the household created a narrative that only she and a select few could fully understand. Lauren's later revelations would confirm suspicions long held by staff, providing a coherent explanation for behaviors and patterns that had previously seemed mysterious or inexplicable. The intricate management of information not only preserved secrecy, but also shaped the entire household's understanding of what had truly occurred. By maintaining control over every aspect of communication, routine, and access, Meghan ensured that the reality of Archie Harrison's early life remained obscured. Staff were left to interpret, guess, and infer, building a landscape of quiet speculation that would later align with Lauren's confession. The deliberate and precise control over information exemplified a level of strategic planning rarely observed in domestic settings, even within the historically secretive structures of the royal household. Even before Lauren's confession, many within the household had quietly begun to notice inconsistencies surrounding Archie Harrison's arrival. These observations were subtle at first, small gaps in information, unusual protocols, and behaviors that did not align with traditional expectations for a newborn in a royal setting. Staff began piecing together these clues in hushed conversations, trying to make sense of the layers of secrecy that surrounded them. What emerged was a slow-burning suspicion that Meghan Markle might not have carried Archie herself. The first clues were logistical. Staff noticed that Archie's presence seemed abrupt, almost as though he had appeared overnight without the usual preparations or medical routines associated with childbirth. Rooms were adapted quickly, schedules changed suddenly, and instructions for care seemed to assume a newborn who had been carefully positioned into the household rather than naturally integrated. While royal households are known for their precision and planning, the speed and unusual nature of these adjustments sparked quiet speculation. Lauren recalled exchanging glances with colleagues when certain protocols felt unprecedented, but no one dared voice their suspicions aloud, understanding the sensitive nature of the household. Timing was another significant clue. Unlike traditional royal births, which often involve a clear sequence of hospital visits, announcements, and visits from family and advisors, Archie's arrival and early public appearances followed a pattern that seemed meticulously curated. Staff observed that there were periods when information about the baby's condition or location was withheld, often requiring multiple layers of approval to gain even basic details. These delays were unusual for seasoned aides accustomed to transparency within the constraints of security, and they began to raise questions. Why was so much being withheld? What were they being protected from learning? Interactions with external medical professionals added to the growing suspicion. Nurses,